welcome along to our lunchtime open newsroom from all of us here at the Good Information Project and the Journal. My name is Christine Bohan, and I am really glad to introduce our highly informed panel, whose brains I am really looking forward to picking on this today. They're going to be sharing their insights into the topic on the EU and the fight against Russian disinformation. I think we'd all say it's been fairly eye-opening to see the volume and the depth of disinformation that Russia has been putting out about the war in Ukraine over the last 2 months. And we're doing a deep dive into disinformation at the Journal at the moment. And we thought that this webinar would be a good space to bring some context to what Russia is doing. So we're going to be looking at how much disinformation is out there about the war, what kind of things are being shared, and also what the social media platforms are doing and what they should be doing about it as we try to stop this, or to kind of shine a light on what is happening at the moment. We're joined by Tommaso Canetta, who's the Deputy Director of Pagella Politica, which is an Italian fact-checking outlet. He also is the coordinator of the fact-checking activities at EDMO, the European Media Digital Observatory, where he pulls together and analyses the work being done by fact-checkers across the continent. We also have Aoife Gallagher, who's an analyst at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Aoife specialises in the use of investigative and data analysis skills to kind of monitor and look at the ways that misinformation and disinformation are spreading across social media and the entire web. And then finally, we have our resident fact checker for the Journal, Brianna Parkins, who's been doing some really excellent work about disinformation during the war, and who was previously a lead fact checker for Media Watch at the ABC network in Australia. So welcome to all of you. I'm really glad to have you here with us today, and to the audience for being with us on this lunchtime special. Just before we get started, if you've got something that you'd like the panelists' opinions on, if you have a question, if something comes up during the chat, if there's anything you'd like to ask the panelists about, leave us a question in the Q&A box, which you can see there in front of you, and we'll try to get to them at the end. We're going to keep this to an hour, so it's just 1:05 now. So we're going to aim to hopefully have this all done by 2 o'clock. So we'll have a couple of minutes at the very end for questions. So I think let's start by looking at how the Russians are spreading disinformation at the moment. Tommaso, you compile a snapshot of the disinformation that EU countries are seeing every month. Can you talk a little bit about what disinformation about the war is being shared across Europe at the moment? And has that changed as the conflict has gone on?
Hi, Christine. Thank you for having me here. Yes, of course, we analyzed a very big amount of disinformation going around the Ukraine war, and we detected some main narratives that are conveyed by these disinformation pieces. I can, list them. We have the narrative about the Russian invasion of Ukraine being actually justified because, for example, there was a genocide of the Russian-speaking population in Donbass, or, for example, because there were US biolabs in Ukraine that needed to be destructed by the Russian forces. Again, another narrative is the one strongly attacking and calumnying Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. So he's a Nazist, he's a Satanist, he's a drug addict, and a coward. He already fled the country, etc. We saw a lot of disinformation targeting Ukrainian refugees that fled the country, and right now they are mostly in Poland, Romania, Slovakia and Hungary, and they are violent, they are fascists, they steal from the countries that they are hosted in. Then again, we have a narrative of Ukrainians and Ukrainians armed forces being Nazis and pro-Nazi, and this kind of rhetoric that is justifying again in some way the aggression of Russia. We have also a pro-Ukraine disinformation narrative that is, let's say, common war propaganda, so exaggerating heroism acts or creating mythology. For example, the one about the Ghost of Kiev, this brave pilot, Ukrainian pilot that single-handed shot down I don't know how many Russian planes. And this, of course, this is information, it's propaganda. Then again, we have narratives about the humanitarian aid to Ukraine being useless because they throw away the food and medicine and they use the trucks to deliver weapons to Ukrainian armies, again, Nazi. And also the last two narratives we detected are an exaggeration of Russophobic sentiment all around Europe, because there is this sentiment, of course, this is true, but it's been exaggerated by false news of Russian-speaking people got beaten in Europe, and it's not true, it's false. And also an exaggerated narrative about the negative consequences by economic point of view of the war in Europe. Again, it's true that we are feeling some negative consequences, but this narrative, of course, exaggerates these consequences using false news and, completely invented piece of news.
And it seems to be across every country across Europe. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. It's actually unprecedented how the disinformation that is traveling across Europe, it's the same in every country. We literally say the same false news in almost every European countries. And about the evolution of the disinformation, I think that disinformation is an ancillary phenomenon of the information. So where the information goes, the disinformation follows. So when the information was really, focused on the Bucha's massacre, of course, we witnessed a lot of disinformation about Bucha. And right now that, the Azovstal steel factories in Mariupol is being bombed, and we have the last Ukrainian soldiers resisting inside these factories. We have a lot of information about this, and so we have a lot of disinformation about this as well. So we hear that there are NATO officials hidden in these factories, or there is a biolabs, one I talked before, hidden in Mariupol steel factories.
That's so interesting, that idea of the disinformation following the information. Yep. We've definitely seen it. Brianna, can you speak about, are we seeing much of this in Ireland? Because the themes that we're talking about, because Ireland can sometimes be a bit of an outlier. Sometimes things take longer to get to Ireland, or we have lower levels of disinformation. Are we seeing these things here being shared?
Yeah, it's really interesting because Ireland, I feel like, has its own little ecosystem, and disinformation travels in a way that is a little bit unique to us, to be honest. And we are seeing accounts that look like, we are seeing the war on fakes, those Russian, created accounts. We're seeing, dribs and drabs popping into the Irish disinformation ecosystem and the Irish spread pages. But it seems like the main takeaway for us is the messaging around refugees, because that to most Irish people is the most tangible thing that they can see impacting their lives from the conflict. Like, yes, they might find that things are harder to buy. Yes, prices might have gone up as a result of the conflict, but it's people arriving into their towns and their kids are going to school with Ukrainian refugees. So that's something that actually is happening in their life. So that seems to sort of be the target. And it's interesting because we're seeing kind of narratives around the housing crisis. So we have a housing crisis in Ireland. We don't have enough houses. So we're seeing that being exploited and turning it into a competition for scarce resources, basically saying all these Ukrainian refugees are arriving. There's not going to be enough medical supplies, not going to be enough housing to go around, kind of pitting, the us versus them narrative. Now, it's interesting because that was already there, that sentiment's just being seized upon, that kind of, we need to look after our own first. That's been around for a long time, those sort of nationalist housing groups. But it's really interesting to see how that narrative is being joined with this anti-refugee narrative. And that's when you're starting to see those groups pick up on the disinformation of, oh, look, I saw someone on TikTok saying that they lent their house in Moldova to a family of Ukrainian refugees and they stole the plasma screen TV off the wall, and they're turning down 5-star hotels just so they can get to Ireland. We're seeing, Irish TikToks scrape the TikToks of Ukrainian refugees talking about their journey to Ireland and going, look, they went on holiday to Italy, the Irish taxpayers paying for their holidays. So there's a real kind of Irish sense of begrudgery about how dare they use our resources. So it's interesting that narrative was already there, but they're using the little dribs and drabs of disinformation to strengthen that narrative and to join it together, I think is what's happening.
And do you think, are these pre-existing groups, are these anti-immigrant groups that existed, or are these pages that, groups or organizations that have been set up specifically to speak about kind of Ukraine issues like this?
Not at all. They were pre-existing, I guess, nationalist groups, but they've changed depending on whatever is kind of the hot topic of the day. Like, they were very active during COVID, basically saying this is our country, we're an anti-corrupt group, we need to give power back to the people. Now it's changed into we need to make sure our own is being looked after. They basically tend to capitalize, and it is for sort of to extend their political capital and also to extend their relevance and trying to capture maybe more people to follow. I think I'm a little bit cynical there. Like, they're not actually don't think that they're, nationalist in like the kind of Nazi sense, but I do think that they are seizing upon this to kind of have that, we're just saying what everyone else can't say. I think that's what they're doing there.
That's so interesting. Aoife, can I ask you about Russia's tactics here? Because we've seen a little bit of this playbook before with Russia spreading disinformation. I'm thinking particularly during the Syrian conflict, when, say, Russia would make claims about victims of bombings actually being paid actors, which we've seen happen again in Ukraine. So how much of this is new? How much of this is like a new approach by Russia? And how much of this is strategies that they've used before in the past?
Yeah, like, as you said, like Russia's been doing this for years. I mean, they've been doing it really for decades, kind of since the Cold War era in a lot of ways. So, and, Russia's a pretty well-oiled machine when it comes to kind of using information warfare. But what's different, of course, in the past, 10 years is that the online world has come into focus, and that Russia has been investing a lot of time and a lot of money into utilizing this kind of new unregulated information system, I suppose, that we have in order to spread disinformation internationally as well. And they've done this in multiple ways. I mean, through the use of armies of online trolls or bot farms that are kind of paid to post and comment online and kind of undermine the facts as we see them. Mm-hmm. But if you kind of dig down, sometimes like as much as Russia's good at doing this, the actual tactics are not overly sophisticated, and that what they really involve doing are, is repeatedly distorting the facts or repeatedly denying responsibility for like atrocities that they are responsible for, with the main aim really of sowing doubt or muddying the waters, really, so that people don't really know what's true and what's really going on, and distracting, I suppose, from what's really going on as well. So if you take something like Bucha, like after Bucha, Russia, denied involvement in that. They claimed that, the dead people that were seen in the streets were actually moving. So the whole thing was set up as a false flag, and that they were, stage actors or whatever. And as you said, we've seen this before in Syria. But even that kind of tactic of contradicting claims about different events. We saw it in 2014 when the Malaysian Airlines flight was shot down by Russian forces over Ukraine. Again, Russia first, they denied that they had any involvement in this and blamed it on Ukraine instead. Even the bioweapons claims, I mean, that's something that Russia's been using for years as well. It's a kind of a tried and tested narrative that they used in Georgia. I think in 2018 was probably the most recent time that was used. And then you have, as I say, I kind of mentioned, bot farms and kind of troll armies and stuff like that there. At the beginning of the war, a few of my colleagues in ISD, they tracked a hashtag campaign that was gaining steam, that was in support of Putin and in support of Russia, and found that it had all the hallmarks really of a Russian influence campaign that was being propagated out through fake social media profiles. So there's kind of a lot going on, but what you kind of see is that the tactics are fairly similar to things that we've seen before. But then there are new things that have kind of been brought into the war as well. The use of fake fact checks, I think, is something that I don't know if we've really seen that before in this context. So yeah, there's a lot going on, both kind of new and kind of old things as well.
Can I take you mentioned fake fact checks there. Brianna's actually done some work on this. And it's been one of the more kind of sinister things that we've seen, where we've seen these fake fact checks being used to spread false news about Ukraine, muddying the waters and producing content that looks like news, but it's actually false information. So, I mean, Brianna, how do fact checkers or how do people working in this area get people to trust their work when you've got Russia doing something like this? Like, is it possible?
I mean, that's the whole sort of point of doing this thing is, if you flood people with enough information, people just turn off completely and give up. And that's kind of maybe we can only guess what the end goal is for Russian people, for Russian disinformation. But that is kind of what the experts are saying is that's the campaign, bombard people with information. Then they will go back to their original government sources because it's the only clear voice that they're hearing. So as much as these fake fact checks are for an international audience, because like, as I said, there's a website called War on Fakes and it translates into like 5 different languages. And it's for spreading this on social media. So you will get the Twitter bots going, you might see a claim like the Bucha massacre didn't happen. There's a dead body that's waving. It's actually just a dead body being hit by a car and being driven over and it's just moving. But it's really, really horrific claims like that. So it does make the fact checker's job a little bit more complicated, a little bit harder, but I don't think it counts us out of the fight completely. I think we're just going to have to get a bit more sophisticated with how we do fact checks. We're going to have to just do things to a higher standard. I'd really like to see us deliver it in maybe a different format, because I think the format we use is good, because we sort of show a picture and a claim, we put the big red sticker fake across, and that way people don't even have to click into our article. They can just see it on Twitter and go, oh, okay, that's what that is. But I think we really need to start expanding into TikTok. We need to start expanding into video. We need to go where the consumers are. We can't just do what we've always been doing and expect it to work. I think we kind of have to step up our game a little bit. But the problem with this website, War on Fakes, is that they actually do perform fact checks that are legitimate. Like, they do fact check the claim that McDonald's completely pulled out of Russia. There are still McDonald's around in Siberia. So that is a legitimate fact check. So that is also quite confusing, because people are going, oh, okay, the Western reporting didn't really tell us this. So it also puts pressure on us and our regular journalists to make sure that they are reporting accurately, because every mistake they make is fuel and fodder for the bad actors and the bad fact checkers. But again, I don't think this counts us out completely. I think it's an added thing that we have to work with, because now we have to fact check the fact checking fact checkers, and it turns into this inception layer. Like, it's just basically fact checking inception, right? But it's not the end of the world. As Aoife said, a lot of the times the things that are being used, they're not sophisticated. The fact checks don't look good. They look like someone's made them in paint. It's not the end of the world. We just have to get very, very smart with what we're checking. We need to get a bit more sophisticated with how we're checking. Make sure we have graphics. Like, there was a great one about debunking the claim that an apartment building that had been shelled actually wasn't an apartment building, it was a gas explosion from 2018. And they did a side-by-side comparison of the two buildings and how they looked exactly different. So I think adding things like graphics, adding interactive features, just getting really smart with how we're presenting them, it's much harder to replicate that if you're just a cheap troll farm. So I think we just need to step up our game, basically.
Yeah. Tommaso, can I ask you why Russia is doing this? Aoife kind of touched on this a little bit, but I mean, is the whole point of Russia putting out this disinformation to try to get people to make them believe the Russian version of events? Or is it more to muddy the waters, to add to the huge amount of information already out there about the war, to make people lose trust in the media, to kind of almost overwhelm people? Like, what's the reason?
It's the second one, I think.
Yeah, right.
It's not as much as to make people believe in the Russian version of the facts, but it's destroying the faith of the public opinion in the official version that they see on the mainstream media of the Western countries. So in the end, anyone can decide what is true and what it's not. And this is very dangerous, I think, because, of course, in the fog of war, it's very hard to see. But what the Russian propaganda wants us to believe is that it's impossible to understand what is true and what is not. Then anything is true and anything is false. And this is wrong. This is not the case, because we have independent journalists working on the ground. We have satellite images. We have the work of fact checkers. And on this note, I wanted to add something about the discussion before about war on fakes, the self-appointed fact checkers from Russia. They are not fact checkers, and it's not enough to self-appoint yourself as a fact checker to be a fact checker. So it's really important also for the public opinion to see the difference between independent fact-checking organizations, and they do the fact-checking work, and they have to stick to very strict criteria to be independent, not receiving any fund from politicians, etc., and having proof of their independence and tertiarity and the professionality of the work, and self-appointing fact-checking organizations that are in the end just Russian propagandists. And of course, they mix together some real fact-checking article where they do check correctly a false news with completely invented propaganda and pro-Russian disinformation, for example, about the massacre of Bucha or the bombing of the Mariupol's hospital, and etc., etc. So this is something that I think it should be really stressed for the public opinion, to see the difference between the real fact checkers and bad actors disguising them as fact checkers.
And it's a difficult one, I think, for the public to to understand
Absolutely.
that.
This is why I think it's a good solution. It's a good system to rely on sources of information that have proved their worthiness during the past years and at least months, not just jumping on the new wagon, just claiming to be a new fact-checking outlet before having any kind of better understanding of who is behind it and how do they work.
Yeah, Aoife, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, just kind of on, why Russia's doing this, I suppose. And, I do think a lot of it is about muddying the waters and making a kind of environment where people don't really know what to believe. But really, what Russian disinformation tactics want to do is destroy people's trust in liberal democracies. And I think that is kind of the overarching theme of all of this. As much as you can try and get people to not believe in what's coming from their media or their government, that's really where all this leads, really, is the kind of destruction of liberal democracy. And I think that's really the main aim. You see this a lot in, a lot of kind of the conspiratorial communities and far-right communities have, very swiftly turned into a pro-Putin stance. And a lot of this is bolstered by the idea that Putin is anti-woke, or that he is, against kind of liberalism, or against, any kind of anti-LGBT rights kind of promotion as well would be very much kind of at the fore of this idea. And a lot of Russian disinformation is about kind of exploiting cracks in society. So they'll find that something like Black Lives Matter or something like that in the US, and they will insert their kind of disinformation into the middle of this to try and, essentially make that crack bigger and to polarize society even more. But I do think that, and it sounds a bit grandiose, but I really do think that the destruction of liberal democracy is really what he's all about. And then I suppose there's another element of this as well, because if the disinformation, it depends who's targeted in the disinformation. In Russia, the disinformation is about getting the people to believe in Putin's version of events as well. And you see this in their kind of language that they're using about the invasion in Ukraine. So they don't call it a war, they don't call it an invasion, they call it a special military operation. They say that they are trying to rid the country of Nazis and trying to kind of liberate the people of Ukraine, I suppose. So, those kind of tactics are about getting the Russians to believe in Putin's kind of version of events as well.
When you talk about that idea of the war on woke and Putin's role there, when he came out and spoke about, say, J.K. Rowling and the attacks on her, is that where does that fit in? Or what was the narrative? What was the reason behind that? I could never quite understand why he did that.
I suppose my understanding of it would be that, within, we can talk about this a bit more in a while, but like the kind of hybrid conspiratorial force that has kind of come out of the pandemic. There is very much an anti-woke line kind of in the middle of that. And there is also a very, very distinct anti-trans line in the middle of that. And I think that a lot of that is trying to exploit that. It's trying to exploit the fact that there is a lot of transphobia within these communities, and the idea that Putin is fighting against this kind of woke culture and cancel culture and things like that. And there's also kind of within that that overarching idea within those conspiratorial communities that Putin is trying to defeat the New World Order or trying to push back against the Great Reset, whichever one of those kind of conspiratorial narratives you want to kind of choose. So I think that's kind of all about that. It's kind of that Putin kind of represents this strongman image, this kind of traditional conservative man who, doesn't fall for this kind of liberal agenda, I suppose, in a lot of ways.
That's so interesting how he's morphed from, that traditional strongman to become to this point in kind of the, not to use the word culture war, but to maybe use it a bit, like to see him inserted into it in that way. Can we just, Aoife, I want to stick with you for a moment. Just why is it that people would fall for disinformation and conspiracy theories? And just to kind of step back a little bit for that, because I think there can sometimes be a bit of a snobbery about it, that there can be this sense that it's people, there's something, smart people wouldn't fall for these kind of theories. But actually, it's not really about how intelligent you are, right? Like, it's about other factors that make people believe in these things.
Yes, for sure. And I think the idea that everyone that believes in conspiracy theories or everyone that falls for disinformation is somewhat, are they're either, stupid or crazy or whatever insulting term you want to throw at them, that is done all the time. And it's been done a lot throughout the pandemic. in my opinion, number one, it's very inaccurate. As you said yourself, it's not about intelligence. You get people with PhDs that believe in conspiracy theories and people that, didn't finish their Leaving Cert. It goes across society, really. There's not really one specific kind of person that believes in this kind of stuff. And it really depends. A lot of it depends on your biases and I suppose the situation that you find yourself in. But really, I think that saying that, people that believe in these things are stupid or crazy or dismissing them offhand is actually, it's really dangerous also in a lot of ways, because I think dismissing them is not something that we should be doing at all, because, we've seen even in the US, we've seen how these kind of communities can really undermine kind of the foundations of democracy in countries like that. But really, in reality, what makes people fall for this stuff is a lot of fear and uncertainty, which has been in abundance for the past couple of years. Conspiracy theories tend to give people very simple answers to very complicated kind of situations. As I say, they appeal to people's biases about how society works or how politics works or how the world works kind of in general. And this gives people a sense of comfort. It gives people a sense that they have answers to really, really, big questions as to why different things happen in the world. And I think that having that kind of access to secret information, it gives people, a sense that they know something that other people don't know, I suppose. And then you add the online world on top of that and you give them a sense of community, which I think was something that was extremely important during the pandemic. You kind of had all these people that were meeting in groups online. They all had their own belief, I suppose, in what was going on, but what kind of the theme that ran through it was that they didn't believe in the mainstream version of events, I suppose, in a lot of ways. So the sense of community as well is definitely something that's very important in today's world. And then I suppose you also have the fact that our brains are actually built to believe in conspiracy theories in a lot of ways. We, it's kind of, hardware that's left over from our hunter-gatherer days, but we tend to try and spot patterns where they don't exist. And, the example that I'll give is that when you look at clouds, your brain will automatically see shapes in the clouds, and that's not because the clouds are that shape, it's just that that's what your brain is doing. And conspiracy theories tend to tell people that there's no such thing as coincidences and that everything happens for a reason. So they kind of promote the idea of making these connections between things that don't exist. So in many ways, conspiratorial belief is a normal belief system that has been warped and distorted into something that is no longer realistic. So yeah, I think that as they ignore people that believe in things like this at your peril, because I think that as time goes on, we'll probably realize that there are, that there's always going to be subjects and different kind of events that will come up that will kind of pull people into this way of thinking.
Brianna, what do you see as the most concerning type of disinformation that might have long-lasting impacts that we're seeing at the moment?
I mean, this changes daily depending on what I've looked at that morning, right? But I think during the pandemic and maybe because of my own background and where I come from, I saw during the COVID misinformation, disinformation, I saw certain communities who had a long-standing history with being badly treated by authorities. We're talking Indigenous communities. We have people in these communities who were forcibly sterilized under colonialization, who were experimented on with drug trials, who were given diseases purposely to try and kill them. So they have a long-standing, reason to distrust, authorities and health systems and doctors. So that's taken years and years and years to heal. And then these communities are also medically vulnerable for a large number of reasons. There's maybe a gap in life expectancy that it's so bad. We see that in the traveling community here. I think it's 11 years difference in the life gap. So you're seeing communities who are already affected by poor health in the average population. They don't necessarily, maybe there's a history of distrust between them and authorities for good reason. And then you're seeing them being targeted by disinformation that's specially crafted to them, going, don't take the vaccine, don't go to the hospital if you get sick, don't trust them, you can't trust them again. And I just think that's particularly heinous because you're exploiting intergenerational trauma and you're also telling a population who is already struggling with health issues not to get help during a pandemic. That has longer lasting consequences. People will get sick, people might die as a result of this. Luckily, we saw Indigenous communities, the elders in Australia, nip this in the bud pretty ASAP, but we did see it happen. And we saw it happen to some extent in traveling communities, and we saw it happen in communities of primarily newly arrived immigrants. There was lots of like WhatsApp sharing between, you can't trust these people, you can't trust because X, Y, and Z, look what they did in the past. So, we saw vulnerable communities being targeted, and it takes years to win back that trust when it's already broken. So I feel like that damaged that relationship there when we're heading in a good direction. So I think that's probably some of the most concerning. And the other type I would say is, again, the type that discourages people to trust in any reporting, any journalism. I hate the term mainstream media. The amount of times family barbecues, events I've been to in the past year where I've been like, well, you're part of the mainstream media, you're being funded by Bill Gates. And I was like, yeah, do you see the house that I'm renting? Like, I'm not being funded by anyone. And it's just that they would believe that even their own family member was being paid off. I mean, that is the dangerous part, when they stop believing anything coming from a responsible source. And I always say, like, look, would you, like, I'm not a plumber, but would you let me come into your house and have a go of your hot water system? And they're like, no. And I was like, so why would you trust someone who's not a journalist, who won't get, sued for defamation, who won't lose their job, who won't get taken for, problems under the code of ethics they signed in on their own country? So it's trying to understand that, traditional journalists and traditional mainstream media have a lot more to lose if we lie compared to faceless Instagram accounts. But yeah, so those for me are the two types that really keep me up at night.
On that point, Brianna, we actually got a good question in from Noreen Whelan saying about, like, is this misinformation or is this propaganda actually working? And she's saying, like, look at the rise in polls for Marine Le Pen in France, the re-election of Orban in Hungary. It's very disconcerting. And I think she's making the point that, for all that, everyone is very aware of the issues with this disinformation, and there's so many efforts being put in to fight it. But at the same time, it's getting through to people, it's coming across. Like, is it working?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the narratives around asylum seekers, there was a huge disinformation in the early 2000s in Australia that these asylum seekers were throwing their own children overboard a ship to be rescued. It was right before an election of a Conservative government, and the government falsely reported that children were being thrown overboard. It didn't happen. The record was eventually corrected, but it really shaped people's opinions of asylum seekers. And if you look at asylum seekers, the policy towards asylum seekers in Australia, you can see that narrative endured. So I do think it is working to a degree, but it has to come from a place of truth. Like what we're seeing in Australia, so what we're seeing in Ireland is, the housing crisis being exploited. There has been an information vacuum around whether Ukrainian refugees will one day be offered social housing. And when governments don't answer questions completely, that's when you get the misinformation coming through. So it's not the be all and end all that, it is working to some extent, because it can be eventually cleared up. But I do think, to some extent, and I'm not sure that's entirely responsible for Marine Le Pen being elected. It just could be a cultural shift and a reaction. And in some ways, I don't want to say that's completely down to that, but I would say there's a small part to play there.
Yeah, we got a question here from Kate O'Sullivan asking about the link between kind of anti-vaxxing conspiracy groups and Russian disinformation, which is a good question. Tommaso, I'm up with this to you because we saw a huge increase in misinformation during the pandemic, during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then some countries have seen, like, say COVID-19 pages on Facebook in particular, pivoting to pro-Russian hoaxes instead. Can you describe how that's happened and what that looks like?
Yes, of course. It happens in many European countries. Actually, we witnessed this phenomenon in Germany, Spain, Italy, many Eastern European countries, and I think it's a global phenomenon. They have, common characteristics, the audiences of the COVID-19 related disinformation and Ukrainian related disinformation. So first of all, the disbelief in the official version on what the traditional newspapers and media are saying. They do not believe that. And this is very, very dangerous, I think, because among the skeptic and the anti-vaxxers and no-masks movements, I think that not anybody was a pro-Putin supporter before the war. But if the channels you ended up trusting during the pandemic now feeds you false information about the situation in Ukraine, there is a huge risk that you will end up believing in the Kremlin propaganda and Russian disinformation. So this is very, very worrying. And I know about the problems. I don't know about the solutions. I heard a lot of interest about the Brianna's point before, and I don't know how we can actually save those people from themselves, because if they don't trust, traditional journalism, journalists that have something to lose in writing something false, and they're too old to be educated in schools, how can we win back their trust? How can we actually convince them that, yes, COVID-19 is dangerous and kills people, and it's not an invention of the big pharma? And how can we convince them that Putin is attacking Ukraine and the war is not staged and it's not true that there is a Nazi regime in Kiev? I don't have the answer. And I know only that history and reality are harsh teachers, and I really would hope that they don't have to learn the lessons on their skins. But right now, I don't have a different solution to propose.
Do you think there's a generational aspect here? You kind of mentioned that a little bit. Like sometimes it seems to be. No, I was going to say, just sometimes it can seem like it's older generations, which you mightn't necessarily think it would be, but it does seem to be older people who are more taken in by. They might have media literacy. Yeah.
I don't have the data to be anything certain about this, but in my experience, yes, I think that the 20 years old people are probably less exposed to this kind of disinformation because they have a better understanding of how the online communication works. And so if an image or a video is blatantly false, they can understand it immediately. While, for example, the 50 years old people using social media, especially Facebook, they are less prepared to actually, counter the disinformation. And also, I think that the situation changes a lot from country to country. Recently, I spoke to some colleagues of mine from Bulgaria. And for example, in Bulgaria, they told me that the eldest people are still quite pro-Russian, even after the invasion, while the youngest people, part of the population, they're really against Putin and pro-Europe. So it depends, of course, country by country, it's different. But in general, I don't see a common pattern about the age issue in detecting and countering disinformation. Maybe there is, but I don't have a research to.
Yeah, it's something we've been trying to figure it out in Ireland as well. Like if there is like kind of cleavages or groups of people who are the ones who are more likely to be taken in. So the age thing is very much an anecdotal thing that we've observed, but I think we're trying to figure out more about it. So you're obviously not that up, or you kind of touched on there about how difficult it is to try and come up with solutions. And I think, Aoife, as part of that, do you think we can ever go back to a time like the way things were before the pandemic, when misinformation seemed to be less widespread? Or has the pandemic and the war just changed everything and flipped it? And now misinformation is just something we have to live with on social media. Like, are you optimistic?
It depends on the day, I think. Unfortunately, we can't turn back the hands of time, right? So I think that we do just have to face that this is probably the situation going forward. And I think in a lot of ways, like Ireland has been, and I'd actually be interested in your thoughts on this as well, but Ireland's been kind of an outlier in the years leading up to the pandemic anyway, especially. Not that we're immune to disinformation or conspiracy theories, but we had fared pretty well compared to the likes of the US and the UK and things like that. But the pandemic changed that pretty substantially, I would say. And what the pandemic really did was kind of bring together a lot of disparate movements and ideologies that would never really have overlapped before. So you have the likes of anti-vaccine campaigners that are now working alongside far-right extremists and borrowing their kind of tactics. So we've seen this kind of all over the world with kind of COVID skeptic movements using pseudo-legal ideologies. So the likes of sovereign citizen ideologies or free man on the land ideologies or common law ideologies. They're all kind of under the one kind of bracket. And those tactics, that was something that took, I think, everyone by surprise that those kind of tactics were being used by those communities. And it really shows that they're really just kind of borrowing tactics and strategies off each other. So we now have this kind of big hybrid radicalized force that includes far-right extremists, anti-vaccine campaigners, new age kind of spirituality groups, anti-5G campaigners. And what they've done is, they've created these huge online ecosystems that stretch across borders. And even though that it's easy to kind of think that the pandemic is behind us, they're not going to go away quietly. And, as we've kind of already discussed, they've already turned into a kind of a pro-Russian kind of stance. So I really think we're going to have to deal with this from here on in. And, these groups are very opportunistic. They will take like anything, the housing crisis being a good example. But another one was the protest that took place down at Dublin Port last week. Was it last week or the week before? And although I'm not 100% sure who's actually behind that, but there was, videos that I saw from on the ground where they were using these kind of pseudo-legal terminologies, which shows that those kind of tactics are now kind of getting into different kind of movements and different kind of protest movements. So I think, to be honest, it's just something that we're going to have to deal with, from here on in.
Yeah, it's really hard to see the kind of things being turned back to the way that they were. I think it's fair to say. I'd like to talk a little bit about the social media companies and their responsibility in all of this. So I think I'll throw this open to all three of you. But do you think that the social media companies are doing enough to stop the spread of disinformation about the war? I think you could see that they did learn some lessons from Trump and from Brexit, and they were slightly faster or more proactive than perhaps might have been expected in dealing with in the rules of engagement for the war. But are they doing enough? I'm going to take that silence as no.
Could I go first? Okay. So, no, they're not yet doing enough. Yes, they're doing better than before. There are a lot of discussion going on at the European level that involves the platforms, and we really hope that in the future, when there will be a code of practice against disinformation at European level, the platforms will be bound to do something more about countering disinformation. If I can just steal 1 minute, I wanted to add something about the previous discussion. I think the most important thing to stress is that disinformation becomes really, really dangerous when it has some kind of support from the political and mainstream media parts of society. So what we witnessed during the pandemic, for example, it was that in the countries where the politicians, the parties are united around the facts of the pandemic, and the mass media were too, the vaccination rate was really, really high. And in the countries where the politics were polarized about the pandemic and the vaccination, and so the mass media, the vaccination rate was really, really low. So this is, I think, the game-changing part of this issue. If the disinformation comes out from the clusters, from the social bubbles where it's circulating, and starts spreading through society and political discourse, and I hate the expression too, but mainstream media.
I think that's a really interesting one for Ireland in particular, where we've seen people on the fringes of the disinformation sphere kind of threatening to go into politics, or talking about going into politics or running for election. And we saw obviously Dolores Cahill, who's a huge spreader of misinformation, actually running for the European Parliament, I think it was 2 years ago, whenever the last elections were. And I just think that that's a really interesting thing to keep track of, where these kind of spreaders of misinformation bleed into politics in particular, and the mainstream media, which is a phrase that we keep using because there is no better one at the moment. Brianna or Aoife, can I talk to you? Like, what do you think about the social media companies? Are they doing enough to stop the spread of disinformation?
Yeah, it depends which one you're talking about. We're seeing, like, it is nice, and we are, like, full disclosure, we are part of the people who do this. It is nice when you see posts on Facebook and Instagram, and they have the blurry thing over the top going, be careful when you click into this. Fact checkers have raised issues with this. You can click on it, and then you can go through the fact check and see just what is it about their content that has put up red flags. So it is nice to see that, but that kind of sometimes feels like, oh, we're doing this, so we're not actually going to try and stop the hate speech. We're not going to actually try and track down and ban bad actors permanently. I'm not going to try and identify, match accounts to IDs. We're maybe, but like, look at this, we've got the lovely little sticker. So it sometimes feels like a bit of a palm off, but it's better than nothing. But should that be the standard that we accept, is like, this it's not nothing. TikTok is the one I'm concerned about the most, because that is where people are going to. It's the people migrating from other platforms to TikTok. The numbers sort of speak for themselves, and because the algorithm is so matched to, it figures out very quickly what you like and what you're into. It can be very easily filter bubbled, so all you will see is this kind of content. It's funny. So in my misinformation sort of account, so a separate account, it's been showing me all like pro Johnny Depp videos during his latest trial. So all I'm hearing about is how Amber Heard is a liar, which I know is a very trivial example to give, but it's really interesting that you will only see the one side of things. You'll never see both. So it's a little bit, I think, more frightening than, say, Instagram, where you have to go out and follow the accounts yourself and you have to hunt things down, whereas TikTok is just a personalized stream for you. So you could never, ever see potentially a conflicting opinion. And there doesn't seem to be, like, I haven't seen any videos pop up with a warning. TikTok say they take them down, but judging from the amount of videos I'm seeing carrying disinformation, I don't think that they do, to be honest.
Aoife, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, generally, probably kind of echo what Brianna said. I mean, I think it depends on what platform you're talking about. And there has been a pretty inconsistent kind of approach across platforms. And again, TikTok would be the one that I would point to as well. They were very slow to start labeling Russian-backed kind of media on the platform. And there's definitely been like quite a number of ways that, people have been able to circumvent different bans, I suppose, across platforms. But I think, when we're talking about kind of regulation and, what the platforms do, I think that, everything that has happened over the past number of years, whereas it's the US election or the pandemic or the war or whatever that is, it's just, I think it's making it very, very obvious that we need some kind of systemic regulation of social media. And I know that is, hopefully coming into effect with the Digital Services Act in Europe, and we'll see how that works out. But I think that, the thing that I always come back to is the need for transparency. Researchers like myself, even the likes of you in the journal, the data that we have access to on these social media platforms is so minuscule that we're trying to get a grasp on what's really going on. But because we have such little access to data, we really only have a limited view on what is actually happening. So as much as the platforms might say, we've put a FactCheck label on this, we've labeled this as Russian state propaganda, blah, 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 blah. We don't actually know how those things are affecting how disinformation is traveling, because the platforms don't really give access to that information. So I think that, in any conversation that is had about the way the platforms kind of operate like this, I think the need for transparency and the need for the platforms to give researchers and academics and journalists access to information so that we can actually really, really understand how these ecosystems work is absolutely key to how we figure this whole thing out.
And you might be best placed to answer this. It's kind of touching on something Kate O'Sullivan left a question in the Q&A there for us. But it's just talking about, do we have any idea about the scale of how much disinformation is being spread by real people and how much of it is bots? I know there's been some research that has said that the level of bots has actually been overestimated by a huge amount. Oftentimes, like, you might just get somebody joining, say, Twitter, for example, and they might look like a bot, but it's just because they're someone who's never used it before, or the way that they've been felt compelled to tweet about something that is quite contentious and looks bot-like. But would you have any indication about the level of bot activity around, say,
the war? I think it's very, very hard to answer, to be honest. And I mean, I do get what you're saying in that the kind of classifications that you would use to say, is this a bot or is this not a bot? It's kind of something, again, that researchers are trying to come up with themselves, and it's absolutely not perfect. As you say, someone could just set up an account and start tweeting about something, and maybe they tweet so frequently that it's seen as being a bot account, but it's not. So that's really kind of, again, it goes back to the transparency thing. I think if we had more information about this, we would be able to actually answer those questions. And they're very, very big questions that need to be asked. We need to know like how much of this is being manipulated and you know, kind of astroturfed campaigns, and whether this is actually coming from real people, you know. So yeah, maybe Tommaso, maybe you might have more of an insight into an answer like that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, thanks for the cue. No, I don't have a precise answer. Recently, we analyzed the tweets of the Russian embassies all around Europe, and you know, the accounts that retweeted those tweet, of course, sharing this information, for example, about bombing of the Mariupol hospital. And I don't have the final data, but first draft, it's a minority. It's like 10-30% the amount of bots that, the amount of accounts that are likely to be bots. And of course, as you said, we are not sure about them being 100% sure bots. But I think that especially about the Ukraine war, Russia doesn't need bots, because if you have 140 million people living in your country exposed to your disinformation and your propaganda every day, so they absolutely in good faith believes that the Russian troops are actually going in Ukraine to save the Ukrainian people, that are brother, it's a brother people, it's a brother population to the Russian one, from a crazy Nazi dictator that it's committing genocide in the Donbass, you support him. And so you are absolutely willing to spread the Russian version, which is of course disinformation in many cases of the facts. So you don't even need the bots. You just have your population doing the same job for you.
Again, it's that nuance between depressing and and pessimistic, but very realistic take on it, I think. And that's so interesting about the percentage of bots that you guys have preliminarily found in that. Before I jump to the last question, I'm going to go for all the panelists. There's one question from the audience there. I think it's more of a comment really from Christian Volkman, saying, is this all just about keeping old money in the driving seat, fossil fuel being the main engine? All these grifters, Trump, Johnson, Putin, seem to be invested that way, which is an interesting take on it. So final question for all three of you is, what advice do you have for people on how to figure out what's true and what's not when they're faced with such a huge amount of information every day across social media, across the media, from friends, from family? Like, how do people, do you have any tips or advice for people?
Okay,
I can.
No, please, ladies first. Ladies first.
Thank you. Like, I kind of come back to, and it's not that I'm anti-social media, but I do think that everyone should have a really, really good think about what social media brings to their lives. And maybe it's just because I'm getting older, but I just feel like social media doesn't really give me anything personally anymore. And even, you know, for example, on Instagram, you know, the Instagram Reels thing that's kind of like TikTok now. You know, I tried to train that essentially to show me things that I wanted to see. Like, I wanted to see, you know, music and comedy and snowboarding videos and dogs. You know what I mean? I wanted, like, when I spend time on that, I want to see things that are enjoyable. But you have no control over that. You really, really don't. As much as you could try and control it, you actually don't. And I don't want to sit down to relax for 10 minutes and end up seeing a video of, you know, you just don't know what's going to come up on that feed. So I think the piece of advice I would give everyone is, have a think about what it brings to your life. Think about, you know, how much time you spend on it. Do you end up losing hours just like mindlessly scrolling and things like that? But when it comes to information, I suppose I always come back to check your sources. And I think that kind of empowering people with it's not, you know, it's easy to check sources. If you're sent a video by someone, before you watch it, Google who is in the video or what the source is. And a quick Google and a quick look on a Wikipedia page can tell you an awful lot of information before you even start watching the video. So I think a lot of it really comes back to checking your sources, to kind of making an effort to get your news, your actual news from the media, as opposed to just, you know, figuring that it'll come to you on social media. Because again, that's all powered by algorithms. It's not really showing you, you know, the most relevant news of the day. It's kind of showing you what it thinks that you want to see. So yeah, I suppose that would be the two pieces of advice that I would give. Yeah,
good advice. Brianna or Tommaso, do you want to go?
Tommaso, go ahead.
No, come on, please, Brianna.
I you know, and I say this to anyone kind of talking about media literacy, is when you're reading something and you look at the author, have a think about, will this person lose their job if they lied to me? Does this person have more to lose if they lie to me than they have to gain? Are they trying to build a social media following? Are they trying to build a platform to one day run for parliament. What's their end game? What are they doing here? Are they selling, Alex Jones, they're selling me weird bone supplements. And that's why they're telling me that that children didn't really die in a massacre. You have to kind of think critically about what is this person getting out of it. And it's something that I something that I struggle with. I mean, I consume an awful lot of information every day. It goes with the job. It's really difficult not to be overwhelmed and to streamline down things. And, I do love Aoife's point about filtering out certain social media things, blocking certain channels. I've set up my Facebook to kind of get rid of weird minion memes and kind of auntie posted vaccine isn't real stories, to just be a rundown of, I like to use it for local media news. So all the county newspapers, you can train your feeds to kind of give you just information from reliable sources. I think it's just really important to think about, where you're getting your information from, and always just double check the sources. I mean, if it's an unnamed source in the story, it might not be 100% accurate. Look for the names, look for somewhere else that you can cross-check this information and multiple people reporting it. Just kind of, basically having those filters in your brain when you're reading stuff.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Last but not least.
Well, I think that Brianna and Eve said it all, but if I have to leave with one last advice is interacting with news is not just reading or seeing, it's also thinking. So just take 1 minute to think what you have all just read, and before sharing, think twice. Just take the time to do a double check, a cross check, see if it's too good to be true, probably it's not true. If it's too bad to be false, probably it's false. So just think about the things that you see and, cultivate a healthy doubt. Don't doubt of anything, but just have a healthy doubt about what you see.
I think that's really good practical advice from all three of you, particularly given the huge amount of information out there at the moment. So thanks for that. I very unexpectedly for a journalist, I think we actually have, we've done this on time. We're not going to run over time. So I'm going to wrap it up here and say thanks very much to our panelists, Aoife, Tommaso and Brianna, for being here. And thanks to you, to our audience, for spending your lunchtime with us. I hope you learned something. I hope you got some good insights from it, and you found the answers to your questions interesting as well. We would love to hear from you about what you'd like to see us covering over the coming month about disinformation. It's very much reader-led, so if there is anything you'd like to see us discussing or covering on the site, do give us a shout. You can either get in touch by emailing us. It's goodinformation@TheJournal.ie. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter. Susan, my colleague, is going to put, she's done it right there, very efficient. That's a link to sign up for our monthly newsletter. If you want to keep track of what we're doing as part of the Good Information Project. And we also have a Facebook group. Speaking of the social media platforms, they are good for some things, like this Facebook group for the Good Information Project. And Susan's put the link into it, into the chat there. So thanks all again. Thanks to everyone for being here today. We really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day.